I have been learning Arabic, namely MSA Classical Arabic alongside the Levantine dialect in Jordan for the past, 1.5 months, and I still have about 2 more months to go. And I wanted to share with you guys my process of how I take notes in Arabic in real time in class to actually learn the fastest. Now, I'm only sharing my personal experience. Take what you will from the video, and I'm going to show you my, not even really a notebook. Literally pieces of paper that I stapled together, you guys. I am definitely not a fancy note-taker person by any means. However, I will show you guys what my notes used to look like. This, and looking back and trying to organize everything, was a nightmare. Going from this to more of this was a lot more helpful. So before, I never color-coded anything, but I highly recommend it, especially because most of us are visual learners, and taking notes in a color-coded way was one of the best ways for me to solidify what I needed to remember how and when, right? So in my notes here, let's go to the very first page. I always put the date as well as the type of class. This is for MSA Classical Arabic. However, there will be some notes that I write down in the Levantine dialect too as we go along. So type of class here, and then I didn't learn any sort of new vocabulary words that day because it was the very first day of class. However, I started with the grammar. Now, I love how my teacher actually writes notes for us on the board because she does somewhat color code them. However, I do make sure to have my own sort of system of color coding. I always write in the darkest color. So that would either be brown and or blue. And the only reason why I'm saying two is because this one ran out of ink pretty quickly. So I started to use blue, and you will see that transition as we go through my notes later on. But I did start out with brown, as you can see, just for the regular overall note-taking purposes. So any sort of titles of certain grammar points that I wanted to note and write down, you'll see here we were studying the structure of idafa, and so that was my most plain, let's say, color coding. And then you'll see here for any sort of examples that would embody the grammar that I was taking notes on would be in green. And then to make sure that I was reminding myself why I even wrote the example down in the first place, I would mark any sort of grammar note that I wanted to point out from my example sentence in also purple here. So here we were just going over some idafa structures, and you can see that I labeled each one with, in Arabic, the noun as well as the pronoun. Pronunciation that I needed to write out in my notes, I would write in red. And you can see that here because we need to pronounce an actual invisible T for ziyadat el-isaf. Now let's go over to a few pages where I was also taking notes in class, and I started to add some new vocab words. And again, I decided to separate the top half of my notes and dedicate it only to vocabulary. Then I would also write everything else down for grammar that day in the second half, allowing a little bit more room for grammar notes. And usually I wouldn't take any more notes for grammar/vocabulary in the same day on more than one piece of paper, which was really good because you bet I am writing a ton of notes here in Jordan. So kind of keeping it condensed is really helpful for me. I will always write down, if I need to, the translation. For example, Tuesday, Yom Thulatha in Fusha Arabic, right next to the spelling in Arabic, and also in the same color. Again, we want to stay consistent as possible with the color coding system we have in place. And then any sort of verbs that were new and or that I was always getting wrong when I was conjugating them would also go into the vocabulary section here. You can see here I did the same thing with kharj versus takharj, right? Because there was an extra T, and sometimes I would forget the extra T when conjugating down here to inta, you. You'll also see one word versus another word, and this was just a really quick note of whenever my teacher made a difference or noted a difference in between certain vocabulary words that meant similar things. So here, this one is more of jogging-ish, not running as fast, to really running fast, right? So I made sure to note that down. Again, I made any sort of extra notes about the intention behind the word in purple. And you'll see up here with akhir and ukhra, right? Other in Fusha Arabic, both in masculine and feminine forms. What I did here was write down in pink this time, adding a new color, the translation in the Levantine dialect. Now, because I am coming from a background that is way more, I would say, knowledgeable about the Levantine dialect, but I hadn't studied any Fusha, I wanted to make sure that I wrote down as many comparisons as possible between what I already knew in the dialect to what was totally new for me, which was in Fusha. And for any of the Arabic students here who are really confused as to how to learn both at the same time, I think this is a really good way to practice your notes and make sure that you are dedicating specific time for your brain to understand the nuances between the dialect and the classical form, right? That is the best way that I've learned to do it. And again, color coding is your best friend here for noting when those differences occur and when you might mess them up. I wrote as well the different grammar categories of what we were talking about that day. So here we were talking about the jumla ismiya versus fa'aliya types of sentences, as well as more of the dual form. And again, you'll see here, I noted the pronunciation in red and then sort of color coded it down to make sure I was consistent with the pronunciation throughout all of my examples here. I wrote in purple any sort of grammar notes that I wanted to make sure I was remembering as I was reading through any sort of examples. In class, we haven't been going over more than anywhere from 4 to 5 new grammar concepts every day, and it's about a 2-hour class pretty much every day. Whatever I write down in the grammar section, I try to keep as organized as possible. However, I do want to make sure that I'm actually paying attention to what the teacher says. It was a little bit of a struggle, I will say, to try to keep all of this color coding knowledge in my brain, but also write in a different language, but also listen to my teacher who was only talking to me in another language. Fusha, to be correct, not the Levantine dialect that I am more comfortable with. And I did have to take some time to get used to doing all of this at once. But once I did have it down, that meant that I didn't have to go back in my notes and use even more time to just organize my notes. Pretty color-coded, whatever, right? Because sometimes I couldn't even decode what my notes were from, for example, this. Okay, so I definitely made sure to take as organized, as color-coded of notes, as organized as possible from the get-go once I figured out what color coding system I wanted. You can also see that I started to change into blue just because I am very cheap here in Jordan and did not want to go out and buy another brown pen. So everything started to be a little bit more in blue. Here are some examples of any sorts of verbs that we started to conjugate in Fusha too. If it was a different verb that was pronounced differently, looked completely differently from what I already knew from the Levantine dialect verb, I would make sure to just write down the Levantine verb again in pink to the side. Now, the way my teacher also teaches, she does not give us all of the information at once. And you can see that embodied here. So we were learning about the different types of verbs in the present and how we need to actually add any sorts of harikat, right, vowel markings onto the letters. So we had learned about mafru'a and also nsub, that for very first day, but we didn't learn what the third one was. So I'm still leaving this blank. However, I know that in our curriculum, we are going to go over that piece of the grammar in the future. She just doesn't want to overwhelm us with all of this information. We're really breaking things down, which I really like, and just using one new concept in example sentences. I just decided to always make sure to go back in my notes and make sure to categorize my notes enough and the grammar categories enough, again, just to make it as quick and as comprehensive as possible for my brain when I am reviewing all of my notes in the first place. This is such an interesting, difficult, fulfilling language actually to learn more, and we're just getting started. So thank you guys. I would welcome you as well to subscribe if you are interested in any more authentic, honest, as well as strategic content in language learning. And we'll see each other in another video soon.